Hello again. Welcome to the lecture video on understanding data ethics. So we're going to talk about data ethics principles and different practices around data ethics, why data ethics is important, what it really means, and so on. So again, to motivate the topic, we're in this deluge of data. As I talked about last time, data is kind of growing exponentially. Um, by individuals and organizations, and this kind of relates to everything you do online is data, basically. So the challenge is here managing this really vast amount of data efficiently and effectively. Um, we're collecting too much data to really know what to do with, so it's really a challenge to know how to manage it. Make sure the data is quality, that the security of the data is really up to date, that type of thing. And that really develops trust with your user base as well. So you want really quality data so you can make insights with your user, and you don't want to put their data at risk. And then also there's AI and machine learning advancements. Um, a lot of data is really coming in, and this is really one reason why AI and machine learning is taking off because there are these tools out there now to be able to collect and store all this data, so we need to start making sense of it. Um, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about that and related to ethics and privacy. So there are ethical and privacy concerns, and they kind of grow as the more and more and more and more data, the volume of data gets a lot bigger, basically. So we need kind of standards and practices around how we kind of manage that data, because really there hasn't really been a law passed, um, a national, federal law to make sure organizations are managing our data, ethically and responsibly. So I'm going to talk about that throughout the class, kind of what those standards are, what those practices should be. Um, so what is data ethics? Data ethics is really the principles and standards I mentioned behind how organizations gather, protect, and use our data. So you really need some agreed upon principles, so that we can kind of trust the institutions that uh, gather our data and actually use it behind the scenes. Because a lot of us don't really know what's going on, and there's actually not a law out there. There's not a federal law of how companies should gather, protect, or use our data in the United States. So having these standards ensures the protection of customer safety and prevents legal issues for organizations. Um, they say in the data camp, data ethics allows us to catch unethical practices and maintain trust. So that trust is really key here, for an organization, right? I think there's a lot of mistrust out there now because there aren't really these standards, and there's this kind of illusion that the tech companies are doing whatever they want with our data, because there really aren't standards in place. And ethics requires really that set of agreed upon principles so that it's not meaningless. It doesn't really lose meaning. Uh, so organizations should stick to some kind of standard out there. And this relates to beneficence, which is what the person in the data ethics video at Google talks about. So make sure to watch that video. It's in the link for the discussion post. It's a real quick video, just an overview of what Google's actually doing. So I mentioned there wasn't a federal law, um, around principles and data ethics, but there is a law in Europe, actually in practice. It's called the General Data Protection Regulation, Europe's data privacy and security law. So it's a bunch of pages worth of requirements for organizations around the world and how they actually protect user data. Some companies will adhere to this in the United States, but it's not most. So there are these 7 different data protection principles that I'll talk about, and then I'll talk about some suggested standards for, kind of companies in America that relate to these principles. So the first principle is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So processing must be lawful, fair, and transparent to the data subject. So if someone actually asks you for your data, um, they need to be upfront about what they're actually going to use or process your data for. It must be within the law and it must be fair to you. So a company, if you're in Europe, actually has to explain and be transparent about what they're actually doing with your data. This relates to purpose limitation. Um, so you must actually define your explicit goal for the data subject or for the user, basically, when you collect the data. And you must actually only process the data for that goal. Um, and so you must actually tell the user what you're doing and only use the data for that specific goal. So for example, we talked about the DIKW pyramid. If you have different goals, you have to really specify the different goals of how you're actually going to use that data collected by the user. Number three is data minimization. So you should collect data and process only as much as you absolutely need for your project. So, you know, defining the actual data you want to collect really only needs to relate to that project specifically, and you can't collect data that's not really related to whatever you're trying to do. Accuracy, you must keep personal data accurate and up to date. So you actually must maintain, the user data. It's against the law if you don't do this. Um, when you log into Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and or even your text messages need to be there. They need to be accurate and up to date. It's against the law. It's kind of a right of the citizens, so that data is accurate every time they use some kind of digital platform. There's also storage limitation. So companies may only store personally identifying data for as long as necessary. So they actually delete your data for, if the project is going to go for 2 years, then your data will be deleted after that, with your permission, basically, for the purposes of the project. Also, integrity and confidentiality. Processing must be done in a way to ensure security, integrity, and confidential. So basically, your data needs to be secure and only accessible to you. And then accountability. Basically, there are audits of all of these different principles to make sure that companies are following them. So the data controller, that's actually the company, is responsible for being able to demonstrate the actual GDPR compliance. So, fines have happened because companies aren't following this. So the point here is in Europe, they actually have these different principles that are against the law if you don't follow. And we don't really have anything federal here. There are some privacy laws in some states, but they're not very comprehensive. California has kind of the most comprehensive one. It's called the Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA, and it's kind of the gold standard in the USA. So a lot of companies will use that, but it's not really required. So there are several principles within this act. So there's the right to know, uh, basically what data is being collected about you and how it's being used. The right to delete your actual data, the right to opt out of the actual sale or sharing of your data, the right to non-discrimination. Um, so actually making sure that the data is not being used to discriminate against you, the right to actually correct your data if there's a mistake, and the right to limit the use of your data and disclose your personal information. So you have a lot of rights here in California, but these don't really hold throughout the country. So DataCamp talks about 5 suggested principles, which I think are the kind of the cornerstone of what we discussed. So I'm going to go over these, and then for your discussion post, I want you to kind of apply these principles to what's going on with TikTok. So if you think about TikTok and the fact that we don't really have any data ethics or data standards about what we really expect of companies to do, TikTok is one single case where some people want it banned, other people are trying to save it. It, the fate of TikTok is still kind of up in the air, but I'll discuss this in a second. But because we don't really have these data standards, um, banning a single company might not actually do anything because then you'll have to ban single companies and then other companies and then other companies. Whereas if you had comprehensive, standards, then you kind of expect a lot of these things from a company. You could cite them for one of these standards, and then that could potentially lead to a ban, or the product might not even be available in the first place in the United States. So a lot of experts kind of agree that there are these 5 different principles that should be in a federal legislation on data protection, and we don't really have that now, which again relates to the case. So think about these in terms of TikTok or for your post if you want to. So the first one is permission. The second one is transparency. The third one is privacy, then intention, and then outcome, which I'll explain each of these individually as well. So the first principle is permission. So this is basically obtaining consent from individuals before collecting, using, or sharing your data. So actually a company asking you if they can, letting you know that they are going to do this, letting you know that they are sharing your data with a third party. Um, so this ensures respect for our autonomy and kind of builds trust between the organization and users. And it also gives individuals like a sense of their own agency. So our data, a lot of it is our life, right? It's kind of our life lived through the internet or through our phones. And a lot of the companies are selling whatever data you're giving them, and we're not really aware of that. So this actually ensures that we have control here. We give permission, we give consent. So why this matters? Prevents unethical practices like misusing or exploiting someone because of their data, reduces legal risks, and again increases that trust between a consumer and an organization. The second principle is transparency. So a company actually being open and honest about how their data is being collected, how your data is being stored, how it's being used, and how it's being shared. So just being totally upfront about what's going on, ensuring that we're fully informed about what happens with our data. And again, this promotes trust and then accountability amongst the organization. So again, it helps us make informed decisions about what we actually want to do with our data. A lot of us, I think, go around not really thinking about this stuff, but companies behind the scenes kind of do whatever they want and don't really tell us. And that can lead to a lot of uncertainty and mistrust, and it doesn't really relate to a lot of autonomy. Um, so again, it prevents misuse also. And again, it strengthens that trust. And this is actually good for organizations because then users will actually, like the companies and build trust with them. So privacy, this is kind of the ability to protect the data from public exposure. So ensuring that the data actually stays where it's supposed to be, doesn't really get leaked. You might not want people to see some of the photos that you've shared or your healthcare data or your social security numbers, stuff like that. So if you're actually consenting to an organization collecting and using your data, you have kind of the right, or at least a reasonable expectation, of the company actually keeping your data private. Um, and you might be surprised to know that it's not really a law that companies have to do that. There's just kind of that, you know, silent agreement between us. Us, we sign the terms and conditions, but it's more of an expectation that the companies do this or they'll lose our trust. And more and more and more companies are, they are protecting our data, but there has been a lot of leaks, and consumers almost expect the companies to have their data, you know, leaked or hacked into at some point in your life, but it is reasonable to expect that not to happen. So this kind of right to privacy is a fundamental human right, and it's really baked into our kind of democratic system, this right to privacy, and it really plays a crucial role in protecting individuals and maintaining trust amongst uh, companies and users. So if you think about privacy in a lot of different aspects of your life, you know, people tend to not think about it in terms of the data, but if someone gets a hold of your data and it's sensitive material, they could potentially like hold a ransom or humiliate you or ruin your reputation or something like that, or even just steal your identity, that type of thing. So again, it gives you control, it gives you autonomy over your actual information. And if things are going well, you assume your data is out there, it's fine. But if you have, depends on who's really in control of the government. And in things like authoritarian regimes, lack of privacy enables surveillance and potential oppressing of groups that the leader might not actually like. So, kind of using your own data against you is a real possibility, in the world today. And a long time ago, we didn't have access to this type of data, and now governments and the people in charge really do have access to everything that you share. And if the wrong, if certain people with certain views were in charge, they could really use that against you. And there's really no standards or law against that. It also protects more vulnerable populations for exploitation or discrimination. And again, privacy is an essential kind of foundation of democracy, kind of the right for your personal stuff to be private, your life to be private, for you to share what you want to share. Um, yeah. And again, it does build trust between organizations as well. The fourth principle is intention. So companies basically would share the purpose and motivation behind collecting and processing and using the data. Um, so it ensures that it's actually benefits individuals. This is kind of a way to make sure companies are doing the right thing with our data. Some people might not object to companies using data if they thought the purpose was, using your data for good, basically. So questions guiding this could be, why are we collecting it? How would this benefit our users or society? And is this aligned with the ethical principles? So there's a big movement towards like using our data intentionally for good. So using your healthcare data, for example, uh, towards a lot of research to cure diseases, or using whatever data you're giving people to, do something that you think is worthwhile. And that intentionality, um, people are arguing it should be kind of baked into our principles. Also, overall, this prevents misuse of our data. Again, it builds trust and encourages responsible innovation. So actually, the development of technologies, for benefit versus, how to get us watching more Netflix, using it in a different way that actually benefits us might be a little more worthwhile and worth us allowing companies to use our data. And then it helps to avoid unintended negative consequences, so minimizing harm to a lot of vulnerable populations. And then the last one is, what's the whole outcome of the data collection and its use? So if you think about all these things, there's a lot of people doing projects with our data that we're allowing them to do and they're not really telling us what they're doing, right? So this outcome actually would have the company tell us, what were the results of their project? What was the impact of their data? What did they learn? What are they going to do now? What actions are they going to take if you use the data-driven decision-making model? Um, so this ensures that data is used responsibly again, and the careful monitoring of its effects on individuals in society and organizations. So again, I think a lot of us would want to know, like, okay, you used this for this certain project. What did you learn, or what have we gained from that? What's really the actionable steps that you took? So here's some questions related to that. What are the short-term and long-term consequences? Does the data usage positively impact users? And again, are there safeguards in place to mitigate unintended consequences? So this allows the consumer to really chime in too, to say, why is my data being used for bad? Or, I don't really like that it's being used in this way. I'd rather it being used for a more positive project rather than a negative one. And then again, protects vulnerable populations again, builds accountability for organizations. So organizations would, it kind of incentivizes them to do more research and use our data for good rather than for bad. I'm not saying they're just doing bad right now, we just don't know. And it promotes data that benefits society over time without causing harm and ensures there's more eyeballs basically watching what organizations are doing. Um, and again, it builds that trust between users. So I want to talk about this case and why this actually matters. If you watch the video, I posted this link to the discussion post. Amazon, uh, about 10 years ago, started using this AI recruiting tool. And basically, they came up with an hiring algorithm to kind of streamline everything because Amazon gets a lot of applicants and they needed kind of a filtering system. So they came up with this algorithm to streamline its recruiting processes. Um, so this system basically was designed to evaluate resumes and identify top candidates for technical roles. So there were different keywords basically in the algorithm. Um, and every algorithm you have to train. Every machine learning model gets trained on data. So it's trained on this what's called historical training data, or in this case, historical data is the resumes of current employees for the past 10 years. So if you look at all the resumes, in 2014 for the past 10 years, it reflected a predominantly male workforce. So predominantly male resumes with predominantly male oriented keywords, basically. So this led the algorithm basically to penalize and filter out resumes that included keyword terms such as women's. So a lot of women will have on their resume like women's chess club or women's rowing club or women's society of women engineers, something like that. So that word was obviously not on a man's resume, and when the algorithm saw the word women, it just filtered it out. Um, so it deprioritized candidates from all women colleges. So all women college, a man did not have that on their resume. So the algorithm basically were like, I don't like this college because I don't know what it is, so I'm just going to throw away this applicant. So basically, the algorithm filtered out all words like women's. I'm just going to type W and then filtered out a keyword, you know, all women's colleges, and then said no, thank you, no, thank you. So what Amazon actually did was they discriminated against women with their algorithm. So this unintended gender bias resulted in discriminatory hiring recommendations. So it actually favored male applicants over equally qualified female applicants just because it had, references to women's colleges or women's um, activities or whatever, right? So Amazon eventually found this and got rid of it in 2017, although they still use a hiring algorithm today. A lot of companies will use these types of hiring algorithms. Often companies now will also film you or record a video of you before you even talk to a person. So, you can think about the training data, the historical data that's used to actually train the model behind the scenes of that. Um, so what I want to really relate this to the data ethics discussion is the Amazon case, and then think about also all the data, all the AI systems and machine learning systems that are being used today to recruit for jobs today. Um, they did not really tell the applicants what was going on behind the scenes, right? So if there were these standards in place, the women that applied to Amazon were, would have to be at least mandated by law uh, information about these five principles. So in terms of permission, the applicants were, they were not informed that their historical data was being used to train the hiring algorithm. The algorithm's decision-making process was not clear, leaving applicants and employees unaware of how resumes were being evaluated. So if you were a woman applying to Amazon, um, you would have to really be informed about what Amazon was doing when you applied. Say, if you clicked submit, they would have to tell you that your resume is going to be basically filtered through our training algorithm, and here's actually how that algorithm works. So it would actually have to tell you what's going on, and that's not the case back then, and it's still not the case today. So in terms of privacy, the use of historical applicant data raised privacy concerns. Candidates may not have consented to their data being repurposed for algorithm training. Um, Intention. So Amazon intended to create a fair hiring process. The algorithm reinforced biases. Um, so they weren't really clear in what they were doing again. And then also the outcome, it basically penalized female candidates, perpetuating gender discrimination. That was the outcome. Amazon wasn't clear and transparent and didn't really tell anyone what they were doing so that people could be aware. And even just being aware, puts many eyeballs on the problem and says, okay, is this okay to do? So I know a lot of you are probably applying for jobs, and I've heard from students before in class that they have to be recorded on a video, when they're applying for a job. And one student told me that he did not want to be recorded, and there was no option to actually opt out of the recording and talk to a person. And he even felt like if he didn't do the recording, that they would not look at him or consider him for an application too. And if these principles were in practice, were actually being implemented, that type of stuff would not happen. So that leads me to discussion post number 2. So what I want you to do is I created a document on Canvas that kind of reviews what's happening with TikTok. Um, it was banned. It's not banned anymore. It's kind of uncertain about what's going to happen. So it's basically, here's what's going on. It's faced criticism and legal scrutiny over concerns about how it collects, stores, and shares user data. So data privacy, transparency, and impact on vulnerable populations. So there's claims against TikTok that basically the user data is shared with the Chinese government because its parent company ByteDance is a Chinese-based um, company. So people are concerned because they don't know what's going on, that there's data privacy risks. Also, transparency issues. Users and regulators have criticized TikTok for not clearly explaining how it collects and uses personal data. So again, there's no law that this has to happen. So TikTok does not share how they're actually collecting data. They're not sharing how they keep data private or if they share it with the Chinese government. And then impact on vulnerable populations. There are concerns that the algorithm promotes harmful content to younger users, affecting mental health, and also promotes kind of a favorable view of certain countries and a not a favorable view of the United States. So again, there's not a lot of information here. There's not a lot of transparency. There's not a lot of information about how TikTok is analyzing the data behind the scenes, or what their algorithm actually does. Because TikTok kind of lives in this world where we don't know anything about it, the government is, saying this is a national security risk, right? But if there were these data ethics standards before even, a company would exist in the United States, for users who even use it, they would have to agree to all of these standards, basically, that I just covered. So what I want you to do in the discussion post is analyze TikTok through these 5 principles that I just kind of discussed. So talk about why, if the 5 principles were already a part of our law, would the TikTok case even be happening right now? TikTok might not even be a company in the first place if we had kind of comprehensive legislation about what types of what companies need to do, right? So go to Canvas. You know, we won't really discuss this stuff, but please discuss this amongst each other, and then answer all the questions on Canvas in the discussion post. Um, and that's pretty much it for the week. So again, think about data ethics. Think about everything you do on the internet, and that we don't have really these standards behind the scenes. And then in your post, explore TikTok and make sure you do the 2 replies as well. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm going to write the word email with my mouse. Just please email me and I'm happy to help. And I'm also, again, on Bellingham campus if you want to meet, or I can meet you over Zoom. So thank you again and see ya.